Hello again, you guys. It's been a while since I've actually done like a sit-down video with you, but I really wanted to do like a recap of everything I've read so far in 2020. This is through like the end of June, because I don't think I've actually finished any books in July yet so far. So my yearly goal was actually to read 20 books, because I had no idea how many books I actually read last year and how many books I've read like on average since graduating. So I kind of set 20 as like a goal to gauge, and I hit 20 at the end of June. So my new goal for the end of the year is to hit 40, and pretty much if I'm still unemployed by the end of the year, I kind of see that happening. So I'm expecting to finish 40 books by the end of the year, which is pretty cool since I don't have anything that's like forcing me to read now that I've graduated. But let me discuss some of the books that I've been reading, and they're primarily nonfiction. I read a lot of like autobiographies about people who have worked either like in the White House or in like the Senate and stuff like that. So you'll definitely see some of that in the list. I'm trying to work in more fiction, so if you have any recommendations for me that are like must reads, let me know. I'm gonna be reading some notes from my laptop because I have forgotten parts of a lot of these books since I read them at the beginning of the year. But the first book I read at the beginning of the year was Monday Isn't Coming, and it's kind of this devastating view of what happens in like general communities, but especially communities of color, when like young girls go missing, and how easily they can be forgotten against the backdrop of like other missing girls and other criminal activities going on. It's about this girl who I'm trying to remember her name, but her friend Monday goes missing, and no one else seems to care, like in the school and her friends, and everyone is like, why are you making this such a big deal? Like everyone assumes that she's just kind of like run away, and that if something happened to her, like she'll surely show up. But it's also based upon like a bunch of disappearances of a lot of young black women that were actually happening in Washington, D.C. at the time. I think it's just like a really important read, discussing those kind of things and how we're complacent and like a lot of injustices that happen to like young women. And without giving too much of the plot away, I'm just gonna say that like all of the stuff in it is like very important to like discuss, but also the plot line got kind of confusing in the book because there are a lot of like timelines happening. It jumps back and forth between like the present several years ago, and then there's also like a jump forward after there's some other kind of like plot reveal that happens, and then time gets even more confusing. So that's one thing I do have to say about the book, is that the structure is a little wonky, but I still think it was a really interesting read. I think I ended up giving it 3 stars on Goodreads, but I would recommend it, and I want to read more of, I think this was by Tiffany D. Jackson. And then Deep Work. This one I actually wrote like a proper review on Goodreads, so I'm just going to read that one out to you because I think it saves a lot of the work of actually reading self-help books, which I read a lot of. They're great to fall asleep to. Sometimes you actually learn things and sometimes you don't. But these are the main 3 takeaways that I had from it. I said, I feel that I knew a great deal of what was discussed in this book already, but here are my biggest takeaways from what actually stuck with me. Don't wait for inspiration, and create rituals for when you have work and enact them regularly. Sit down and get the work done. Additionally, create rituals for winding down and relaxing, so that you can work into your days in order to clear your mind and stop thinking about work and additional responsibilities. This would especially work better if I didn't have such like a chaotic sleep schedule. There's sometimes when I really can't sleep or really can't wake up during the day. But for days when you really have to get stuff done, it's just really good to like go back to the same spot every day. And like, this is where I work. This is where I do fun things. And I think that's why I have like these 2 desks. I primarily try and do like art and writing on this desk, and try and keep that desk for just like streaming, playing games, recreationally watching like YouTube videos, so that it's at least like video work and like other kinds of like creative work happening over here. I do mix them sometimes, but I think that those are really good things to do. Also, restrict your distractions throughout the day by planning your work. So like group things like emails together to do like just during this part of the day, group things that are like editing a video to like another part of the day, and like thumbnails. So like the creative work that are like big projects for their things that are gonna have to have like specific replies, and you're gonna need to do probably a lot of them for like a different kind of part of the day. The other thing I said was the more you restrict distractions and plan out your day, the more productive you will be. It's best to batch similar tasks together to get out of the way instead of sprinkling them in here and there. Bigger tasks are best done in 1 to 2 hour spans. And so you do like those big projects at one point and like try and get all of that done in like one big batch, and then all of the smaller stuff that normally you would sprinkle in, try and group all of those together to get out of the way. The third book that I read this year was Little Fires Everywhere, and I actually read it before I realized that there was going to be a miniseries happening on Hulu, and I highly, highly recommend that if you're going to read the book, you read the book before you watch the show, because the book was this incredible, complex portrait of like generally just American life, and so much more about like parents and adults than I think I had seen in any other book as of this point. A lot of what I've read has still been like YA, and it was just incredible. I thought that the characters were written so well, especially the fact that there were so many characters, and the fact that everyone was written so complexly was just incredible to me. And then any gaps that you really have in reading the book, the Hulu show kind of fills in everything in this incredible way. Like there is just so much more depth to all the characters. Storylines that you thought were like maybe like hit or miss, like those things got filled in the show. And I just highly, highly recommend that. I don't want to give anything away if you haven't heard anything about Little Fires Everywhere, but just read books by Celeste Ng. Her other book, Everything I Never Told You, was also really good, and probably my favorite book that I read in my fiction after 1960 class. And I just want to read more books by Celeste Ng. The next book I read. So this was the beginning of my dive into all of my political autobiographies, and I read Tough Love by Susan Rice, who, let me say this out first. If you are a fan of The West Wing or have any curiosities about working in the White House and what like the day-to-day kind of tasks and drama and climate of that kind of thing is, I would highly recommend reading Tough Love by Susan Rice. She was what was she? She was a UN ambassador and then a national security advisor during the Obama administration, and just like a huge insight into what it's like being a woman in politics and then being a Black woman in politics, because there are so many things that you kind of get given because they expect you to be like the more emotional person in the room, or they expect you to be like the motherly one, or you're a woman so you're gonna do these kind of tasks. Like it just boggles my mind, like the certain things that like happened and the things that got blamed on her, and she was totally just like thrown in to Fox News chaos essentially. So I highly recommend that. It's still a very timely book. If you think that like AOC, like a lot of the shit that she's going through now, like Susan Rice was like the target during the Obama administration, especially after the Benghazi attack. It's very eye-opening to see just how politics, the inside of it, works for a woman. After that, I read Atomic Habits, which I don't personally remember reading that much. I gave it 5 stars, but this is especially a good book for if you do a lot of the same tasks each and every day, so that you can try and get all of those good habits secured into your schedule and really like eliminate a lot of the bad habits that you repeat constantly. So just kind of like associating them with like different, better things to do. So I guess I recommend it. So I also read There's Something About Sweetie, which is the kind of sequel to When Dimple Met Rishi. And this one's about Rishi's brother Ashish, who like you get a backstory on in the first book, and I actually would have preferred if they didn't. Like, the fact that these are connected, like, kind of makes it cute if you read the first book, but I feel like it actually kind of takes away from the story in this one. But otherwise, Sweetie is this athlete. She's in, like, a track, and she's a runner, and she's, like, very, like, athletic, and she's built, but because she's fat, it's something that she struggles with, and especially the way that, like, her mom sees her, she struggles with. And her mom is, like, kind of embarrassed that, like, that's the way that she looks and presents herself, and that she's athletic. And so it's a different twist on, like, how Dimple feels in the first book. Because Dimple is kind of this, like, nerdy girl. She doesn't really wear makeup. She wears glasses. Like, she's not traditionally, like, pretty. And so, and while Dimple's more of, like, a fiery, like, sassy kind of character, I feel like Sweetie is also, like, a very, like, confident character, but also very, like, goofy. So, like, her and Ashish work really well together in, like, that way. This is, like, kind of, it's a sweet story. It's very much like When Dimple Met Rishi. Like, it's going to be, like, kind of, like, predictable in a lot of, like, the romantic tropes that come along. But I still think it had, like, a really good message, and it was still a really sweet book. I didn't love it as much as I loved When Dimple Met Rishi. I felt like that one was just everything I wanted from that story, and I would recommend reading that first, definitely. But I'm more interested in the next book, which is also kind of, like, in this series. This is for my dark academia fans. I read If We Were Villains, which is supposed to be, like, the Shakespeare version of, like, dark academia. Like, these are these super dedicated, like, actors. They're in college, like, at this very, like, esteemed, like, acting school. They pretty much only do Shakespeare. They're supposed to be, like, very professionally trained, but all of the characters are very much, like, caricatures. Like, they seem so overblown. Like, if you've ever seen Theater Kids, this is, like, insane. Like, they're just a Shakespeare play, like, trapped in the real world, and it just became, like, super unbelievable. I wasn't invested in any of the characters, and I ended up just getting really bored. I read through it to the end. It was also super predictable. Nothing that I wanted to happen really happened in this book, and it was just, like, a huge letdown for, like, everything I'd heard about it, because it was like, oh, if you loved A Secret History, like, if you love theater, you absolutely have to read If We Were Villains, and I was just extremely disappointed. So do not recommend If We Were Villains. I literally did not write a review for Bored and Brilliant. Probably good if you can actually detach from things. I remember that there were, like, steps that you're supposed to do, like, implement into your life, like, oh, start doing these tasks, and then try doing this exercise, where it's like, you step away from your phone, and you don't, like, listen to anything this day, or you don't do social media for, like, a week, and I'm like, that's kind of, like, what I do, though. Which is just, like, not helpful for me, but if you can actually step away from technology and let your thoughts be, do that. But I prefer getting creative ideas from, like, lots of, like, different stimuli, and this was, like, the exact opposite about that. Especially during coronavirus right now, I'm like, I don't want to be this bored, and I can't really walk around, like, go everywhere and, like, listen to other people and just be alone with myself. Like, I'm at home, I'm here with my mom all the time. It was just not gonna happen during Corona time. This next book is very much along the lines of the Susan Rice book. This is Who Thought This Was a Good Idea by Alyssa Mastromonaco. She was the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. But she's really, like, goofy. She's like me, exactly. Like, it's unsettling. Bad at relationships, kind of chaotic, and, like, where, like, all of her college things were going, all of her careers after college. She's kind of all over the place. She has IBS, so, like, all of the stories surrounding, like, where they'd have to, like, go in, like, different countries, like, with the Obama administration, and she'd have to be like, I can't eat any of this food, otherwise, like, my stomach will, like, attack me, or if there was like something important happening and like she's like, I can't do this right now, and like having to actually like ask for help like when your health is like a thing. And then also just again being a woman in the White House and things that are like overlooked by all the men is something that was really interesting in this book. And then just it's more fun, I think, than Susan Rice's book. I think she was also much more behind the scenes. Susan Rice had more of like a public face during the administration, so I'd recommend that if you want more of like the lighthearted West Wing anecdotes. Super inspirational though. All these women in the White House. In a complete turn, Uncanny Valley was one of the best books that I've read this year. Especially the fact that Uncanny Valley is about being a woman in Silicon Valley in startup culture. What it's like just in startup culture these days. And especially the fact that there is this problem of startups kind of starting up and getting a ton of venture capital and having no actual way to pay any of that money back. Which is a huge problem for a lot of startups right now. If you've seen like Patreon, like people talking about it, like even Twitter right now, they're like ad revenue is like super down. We're gonna have to go to some kind of subscription model. It's because these big places that you see have like big, is IPO like the right word for that? They're just valued at like a very high price. That tends to be because there is a lot of investment in it and they expect to have like a better return on it. And if you can't return on that, that's why like startups end up like failing after a couple of years. That's why WeWork is like failing even before the pandemic happened. But yeah, you see these places that get like tons of like interest and like all the startup money, and then they get like too many employees and they don't have enough work to give them, is like one thing that's like discussed in this book. She was pretty much saying that like they give you a job and you're kind of supposed to make your own job, like be like, what can I do for the company with like my set of skills? Like what do we need? What can I be doing? And you have all these cool things happening around you. There's all these like cool catered lunches. You're around all these other cool people in tech. You're having a lot of fun. But it's like, what are we actually doing is like a weird thing. But that and the whole money aspect and being a woman around bro culture. She worked at, God, what's that coding website? GitHub? She worked at GitHub for a while, and GitHub was kind of a mess on the bro culture side. So that was just super fascinating. And you can see kind of all the different tiers that she goes through in there, because she used to work in publishing, and then she went into startup. And it's just a huge contrast, and I highly, highly recommend. Midnight in Chernobyl. If you watch the Chernobyl series, I hear that this is the book that it was actually based on, and it was an incredible retelling of events that actually happened during the Chernobyl like meltdown, and just how it happened on like years before, like all of the oversights that happened, because they were like, either we had to save money or we wanted people in this town, and we didn't think about like how close people should be to like the actual like factory. It ended up being like people who were living in Pripyat, like nearby, ended up like crossing over a line that they weren't really supposed to, and ended up living far too close. And so even aside from the people who were like in the factory, and like there were some people who were like literally like obliterated in like moments when the meltdown happened. And then just after that, just so much radiation spread so quickly. And then the Soviet Union, of course, was trying to just cover it up and make it not seem like it was a big deal. Everything was under control. Everyone was going to be fine. And it definitely wasn't. And that led to so many different things happening years later. And so that's really interesting. It goes back and forth between like the events happening in like chronological order, the stuff that happened before, actual accounts from people, and then the science is also thrown in there. So it makes it super engaging, super interesting. I highly recommend the audiobook. Yeah, it was just really a very engaging read. Like, I was not bored for one moment of this book. Also, in another turn of events, I read Educated by Tara Westover, And this was so not the book that I thought it was going to be. It was kind of sold to me, or at least like the way that they marketed this book was definitely like, these are survivalists, like disconnected from the world, like they're super religious, and like this girl has like never, I don't know, had like a normal life like in society. And it was not like that at all. It's her family, they're kind of super religious in like the sense that like they think that like the end of days is coming. Their dad is like super controlling. He's probably bipolar. And they live on a hill near the town where like their other family lives, and they're very close to town. Like Tara ends up taking like a dance class in town. Her other grandma lives in town. Her aunt lives in town. Her older brothers went to high school in town. She ends up getting a job in town. Like, they're very much still like close to society, even if they're like the weird ones who live on the hill. They have a computer in their house. Like, they end up getting like more technology as the years go on, like despite the fact that like as much as they say that their dad like doesn't want any of this stuff, it totally ends up happening anyway. The most jarring part of this book is actually just the lack of care that their dad pays, especially to the fact that there's just no safety in their family. Like, their dad drives recklessly. He doesn't take any safety precautions for, they kind of have like a kind of junkyard in the back, and they get scrap metal and they sell that. And there are just like lots of incidences where people almost get like maimed, people get hit in the head, people end up like bleeding internally. Like, it is just jarring, like how much this man is like, but he's like, God will protect us, but so much so that he ends up hurting his family like emotionally and physically, and it's a very like abusive family structure. And I don't know, that was probably the most eye-opening part of it, is that just the abuse that all of these children like went through, and then the cycle of abuse and how it continues in like some of the brothers' like marriages afterwards, and how Tara kind of gets like exiled from her family. I don't super recommend this book. Again, it wasn't anything that I thought it was. I think it's more, yes, she ends up going to college. She did have to teach herself a lot of stuff, but also, I don't know how I feel about like that part where it was like she did this all on her own to like get out of her town and her home and go to college. She ends up going to Harvard, I think, and like to Oxford, doing like all these dissertations and stuff. And so that part's like the interesting part. She ends up doing all these different studies about religion, I believe. Or is it people with bipolar disorder? I can't remember. But that's probably the most interesting book. It's like actually like when she gets out of town and her house. But her parents kind of get famous for all this like natural medicine and stuff that they're doing at the end. So it's also kind of weird and culty in that sense. It's an odd book. I don't know how it's rated so highly. It was just not for me. This book is a classic, but it is not for me. I read Slaughterhouse-Five. I probably read the last 2 hours of it 3 or 4 times because I could not get through it. I kept falling asleep. But basically, I feel like I can definitely see where this was like a very groundbreaking book when it came out. Like, it is non-chronological. There are flashbacks like forward and backwards in time, and it's a way to explore like the PTSD of the war that like the main character Billy Pilgrim is like going through, and he's expressing his PTSD through these kind of like he was abducted by aliens, and that the aliens are like giving him all of these lessons, and they're taking him forward and back through time so that he can reflect on all of those periods in his life. But it's more like he's sucked back in like a moment, like he'll be in the present and then he'll be taken back, but it's explained as it's like time travel. And there's all these comedic moments that are supposed to be either like about the aliens and about this like human zoo that they put them in, and it's him and a porn star who end up having a baby. I feel like those are just like weird moments along with the aliens. They're just so strange to me, and like I feel like it's not necessary. And that could just be me not liking Kurt Vonnegut's style. He did Slaughterhouse-Five. I was just not there for it. And I really enjoyed all the parts that were like actually about the war. I feel like it totally captured like this coldness and this kind of stuck feeling of like being drafted into the war, and essentially you're there and you're fighting against other people, but like you've kind of lost sight of who's good, who's bad, is anyone good, is anyone bad, and they're all trying to justify it by being like, this is just how it was going to happen anyway. Like, no matter what I did, this is what was going to happen. And so, like, that's the PTSD part about it, definitely, is that it's someone who, like, definitely doesn't want to be there, someone who wasn't really, like, cut out for war, and who was just kind of, like, scarred by this experience of, like, loss and struggle, and it's life and death constantly, and just pale suffering. But I think that those parts of the book are really interesting. Like I said, I feel like the non-chronological thing seems to have been like really new around like the 60s or 70s. And like now it's so overplayed. I would love more books that were told in like linear order or by multiple narrators or just something, because I am kind of done with flashbacks and flash forwards. Speaking about the shape of books though, Meander, Spiral, Explode by Jane Allison is the book for writers who are visual learners. Like, I have tried to read so many books that are about like narrative fiction and story structure, like Save the Cat and things like that, are like very prescriptive and like, this is the story arc, this is more of like the blockbuster novel, and like the mainstream like sellable narrative is like a lot of things are shaped like this, certain genres are like this. That is like too, I don't know, weird for me, but this book definitely breaks down things into more like story structure. So it's like some of them are like more linear narratives, some of them have like the traditional arc, and so she has them in like meanders, so it's like they kind of go here and there and here and there, so you're like going through like a linear story and you kind of like meander away from like the main point for a bit, but then you always come back. There's other times where it can be like segmented, and it can totally be like different perspectives, different stories that are like loosely a part of this same thing, and it totally goes into like so many different types of stories that are just not the normal arc, which helped me just see more of like what was possible. And throughout all of it, it recommends different pieces of literature, and it has like full excerpts from things that are usually like 2 to 3 pages. And then I wanted to read all of those books after reading this book. I feel like it was just very interesting, and all of the pieces that she chose were fascinating, and then she breaks it down in this very poetic way, which I guess maybe as a poet it just really drew me in. But I think this book was just like a beautiful way of describing art and the different ways the human experience can be told, and how it doesn't have to be so literal and so repetitive. Like, your story can definitely take you on different paths, and you just have to let the story kind of tell you how it's supposed to go. So I super recommend Meander, Spiral, Explode. What I talk about when I talk about Running by Haruki Murakami. I haven't read much of Murakami, but I know that he has like all these fascinating kind of like surreal experiences in his books, and he also is like obsessed with running, which was just fascinating to hear about, because he's very into routines, and he thinks that like repeating something over and over again is kind of how you get better at it. And this book was him kind of preparing to like do a marathon, and it felt like you were on a run with him. Like, this is a pretty short audiobook, and the whole time it just kind of felt like it was being carried forward in this kind of like pace of like where your thoughts would be going on a run, how you'd kind of go all over the place to just like these little tangents, but how they're all kind of like related to just kind of like moving forward and like getting better, what happens when you like struggle through something, how you won't always become better over time. Sometimes you will stagnate, sometimes you will regress. And that was really interesting, especially considering like Murakami is a writer, and over time like you feel like as you get older, like, will I get better up until a point, or will I start to just get like, oh, like, have I peaked at this point? But it was just a very interesting insight into all of it. Like, things are just going to be different over time is kind of my main takeaway from that book. Really recommend Murakami's voice. Very just good read for like one day if you just want to blow through it. And then The Goldfinch. I did not finish this book. This is the only book that I DNF'd on here. I got more than halfway through The Goldfinch, and I loved A Secret History. I thought that book was super interesting, so I was like, oh, it's another long book by Donna Tartt. Like, she's really good at telling these like long narrative stories. You know, I loved young Theo. I feel like young Theo was really interesting. He's going through a lot of things in his life. Lost his mom. Has this painting. Found family. Ooh. But then, like, it goes 8 years forward, and I hate old Theo. And I just lost so much interest after the time jump that I, like, couldn't get myself reinvested. And I feel like I just have to watch the movie to actually see what happens and see if I should go back and read the rest of the book. But as of right now, I just didn't like him. Didn't like the character, and I couldn't get back into the story after that. Oh my god, I started The Golden Compass, which is a part of his Dark Material series. And I know this is more like a children's like fantasy book, but I'm trying to get back into anything that isn't like realistic fiction, and this was interesting. I feel like sometimes I hated Lyra, but she was also like a precocious like little girl, and I think that was more interesting, and the other characters, and just the fact that there are like these demons that like they're connected to, like, and that's your soul, and the whole fact that like scientists are trying to harvest your like spirit energy to like progress the world, to like get to another dimension and to like use it as like some other power source was like, so I could see that happening. And I thought all of that was really interesting, so I'm excited to read the rest of the series. We Should All Be Feminists was also a very interesting short read that I read, and I feel like this was a good way to get me out of my Eurocentric bubble, because it actually like takes place in Africa, like it is told by an African woman, and you get to see like how different things are like in a day-to-day, and like how not different they are at all. Like just how cultures put women into a box, and how you have to break out of that box over and over and over again. But it was also set up very much like, it felt like a documentary. It felt like it had segments of her life that are kind of like, I always describe things like House on Mango Street, like these little like vignettes of her life. And it was just interesting to like have a view into like the day-to-day of someone else in another country. Is it a vlog? Is it like a feminist vlog is like what this feels like? It definitely did, but it was so interesting, and I want to read more stuff by her. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This was just so different from like so many American perspectives that you always get, because it is a Black female perspective. It's written by a Black female and told by a Black female, like in her own body and her own mind. It was just like, you so don't get that, especially with like historical narratives. And it was right in between like the Civil War and like the early 1930s. It's like right in that like Harlem Renaissance period, and it's in like the deep south, so in like Florida, and it is just incredible because it is the story of a woman who is like kind of told to like grow up too early because her grandma had a child out of wedlock and her mom had a child out of wedlock, and they were worried about Janie and that the same thing would happen to her. So they wanted her to get like married like really early, and so basically like she ends up marrying for security, and she's super dissatisfied, and then she ends up getting married after that for what she thinks is love. It's more of just an escape. And then like what happens when that escape is not like what you expected it to be either, and when you kind of just become bored with your life, and then what happens when you do get married for love, and when the world just changes around you. But it was just such an incredible story of like a woman who's like her own person, who is figuring that out, like especially because it starts when she's like 16 or something like that, and like all of these men that like she goes from like man to man to man, but it's also like still such an early part of her life where all of this like love and loss and pain is happening. And it was just incredible. And if there's anything that's going to deter you, it's that there's a lot of dialect in it. So like there's very much like southern black jargon, and I would recommend the audiobook because I don't know how it's written, but I know that I've read books in dialect before, and if anything, it's very weird just the way that they write it out, but hearing words is just much easier for me. So I would recommend the audiobook. It was also really nice because there was like transitional like ambient music, which I really enjoyed. This was the funniest book I've read in a while. I read The Awakening, which is the first book in the Vampire Diaries series. They put in so much work to make that TV show, is what I keep telling everybody. And that's why I want to read the rest of the series, because I know I read the first 2 books when I was much younger. And it's just insane how different it is from the TV show. Like, they combine characters, they end up combining, like, Meredith and Bonnie to make Bonnie. And then I feel like they also probably take some pieces of Meredith and put it into Caroline so that Caroline's more likable. But in the books, like, Caroline is just, like, the cool girl, icy. Bonnie is this, like, ginger, like, European girl. And, like, all of her lineage of witches are from, like, Scotland or something. And the Salvatore brothers are, like, not just Italian, they are, like, Italian. Like, they are from Italy. And when they knew Catherine, it was in, like, 1500. So it makes it much more disconnected from, like, a time period perspective. Like, it's harder to see them and Catherine and, like, all their olden ways. And compared to the TV show, where it puts them in, like, Civil War Virginia, and, like, they grew up in Mystic Falls instead of... In the book, there's, like, no real reason why Stefan should be in Virginia. Like, he's just, like, a new place to settle down. And they have these really bad accents in the audiobook. Like, they sound like Dracula. Like, I want to suck your blood. Like, it's a very cheesy Italian accent that the audiobook reader gives them. And it was just really funny to hear and see. The only thing that was even kind of similar in the books, I feel like, was the fact that Tanner dies at, like, the Halloween thing. Is that even when he dies in the show? No, he dies at a football game. That was the only thing that was kind of similar, I guess. Tanner dies. And Elena's parents die, like, 3 years before the book takes place. So, like, she's still mourning the loss of her parents, but also it's, like, again, you feel very disconnected from that. And her little sister is, like, 4. There is no Jeremy. Her Aunt Jenna is named something like Judith. And she's a Southern belle. And she has a fiance, which is much less fun than, like, and Jenna, who's kind of chaotic grad student. Like, that's way more fun. And then also, like, having the dysfunctional brother. Like, that adds so much more interesting, like, depth to the whole family thing. Losing your parents, like, very recently, and, like, how that affects, like, teenagers. Like, that was more interesting. And this, like, the book starts with her coming back from, like, Paris for some reason. And she has all this cute stuff from Paris, and Elena's like, I have to have him, I have to have Stefan. And she just, that's all she has, like, is wanting Stefan. And I don't know, I just do not like anyone in the books. If anything, it's cheesy and funny, and it shows you how much work Julie Plec and the other showrunners put into adapting this into an actually, like, likable and sustainable TV show. So if you're into screenwriting, I recommend reading some of these books and watching the Vampire Diaries, like, first season, and the first book at least, and just doing some interesting comparisons and thinking about how you could adapt some stuff in the future. And the last book that I read in June was My Dark Vanessa, which was absolutely my favorite fiction book of the year, probably my favorite fiction book in the past several years. This is a very complicated story and a very now story. I think it was only published in, like, 2017, 2018 maybe. It is surrounding kind of, like, the Me Too movement, and this one does go back and forth between, like, current day and the past, and it's Vanessa now as, like, a 30-year-old going back to see herself when she was about, like, 16 and at a boarding school. And the relationship that happened between her and her English teacher. And then going back to, like, current day, and this teacher is being accused of, like, sexual assault by, like, students, and, like, several students are, like, coming out, and, like, the whole Me Too movement happening, like, throughout the country, like, that happening, but also the fact that her relationship not only happened when she was younger, it kind of, like, has continued, like, throughout the years. Like, they're still off and on and, like, very close, and, like, how having something like that when you're so young really, like, molds you and your perception of relationships with, like, younger women and older men. You think, like, oh, like, she's too young, but you don't think about that for yourself. And it's very much like she can't come to grips with the fact that, like, she was abused and, like, she was, like, raped and all of these things that happened. And it's very complex when it comes to just relationships, when it comes to the complacency of culture, like how we are all taught to kind of look away from young women and not believe them when we say, like, oh, they dress, like, too scandalous, or, like, she was coming on to him too, or, like, as long as it was consensual, was it okay? And it's a lot. I've recommended it to probably everybody I know, especially talking to it with one of my cousins, and I think that it's just a very complex read and something that everyone should be reading and just thinking about, because, yeah, I feel like we do not give these kinds of stories enough credit, especially when it comes to young women and the older men that prey on them. And I would love to read more books like this, because it very much is written to inspire a conversation and to make you think about where we draw the lines, and how we always say, like, well, did what happened to her, like, that's worse than what happened to me, so, like, I can't feel this way about what happened to me because it wasn't bad enough. And how to change that kind of thinking is always also just a very just interesting thing to think about. This book, I will probably reread it again in another year or so, but there is just so much to unpack with it. I can't even. I'm working through finding more books on the reading list that the author actually came out with. Her name is, like, Kate Elizabeth Russell, I think, and on her website she has a bunch of books and plays and poems and stuff that inspired her to write this book, and I kind of just want to go through the backlog of that for a while and dive into that conversation. So these are the books that I've read so far in 2020. I will be making another video at the end of the year or the very beginning of 2021. Doesn't that sound alarming that we're like this close to 2021 already? We've been in pandemic mode and it's just deeply unsettling. But at least there won't really be that many new books before next year. I guess that's both sad and like good for me because I can't build my reading list out more than it already is. It's pretty extensive at this point. But I love you guys. I'll see you soon. Let me know what you've been reading and let me know if you recommend anything like the books I've been reading or totally different. I'd love to also follow you on Goodreads. I will link mine in the description below. Please link me yours because I just need to see what other people are reading. Love you. See you next time. Bye-bye.